Have you ever wondered why vampires are just so damn sexy? Have you ever noticed that there are a lot of gay characters in a lot of pieces of vampire media? Have you ever thought to yourself, man, Count Dracula is really fruity, but I just can't prove it? Happy Halloween, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I'm a lesbian who stays gothic lit, and if you asked any of those questions, that's what we're gonna answer today. You're in the right place. So we're gonna look at some of the most popular vampire stories, and I'm gonna demonstrate to you that every single piece of media, every single time a vampire shows up, stone cold gay. And just to prove how over the top we like to queer code our vampires, I'm gonna do it with Twilight. Yeah, even Twilight. I won't hit every single vampire book or movie, I just don't have time to do it all. But that's not stopping you. If I miss something, if you want to talk about a piece of vampire media, hit my comment section, go type away there. I'd love to hear about your favorite vampire movies, your favorite books, whatever's on your mind. For the sake of this video, we are going to organize our vampire media into 3 categories. First, we're going to look at Dracula, because that's kind of the father of the genre right now. Then we're going to look at 20th century vampires, which are mostly adaptations of Dracula. And then 21st century vampires, which is when we start to get into vampire romance. I've studied some of these works more than others, so if I miss something, again, just hit the comment section. It takes a village. Without any further ado, let's get into it. Before we get into any specific examples, we need to distinguish between queer as an adjective and queering as a verb, because these are terms I'm going to be using to talk about these pieces of media, and they are very different. We typically use queer as an umbrella term for sexuality. That is not how I'm regularly going to use it in this video. Instead, I'm going to use it as a verb. To queer something is to subvert our expectations around gender, heteronormativity, and systems of oppression. We as a society have very strict gender roles, and we like to divvy them up and put them in 2 perfect boxes. In reality, it rarely works out that way. I'm going to show you an example from film that I feel like demonstrates this concept well. So first we're going to look at a scene from the James Bond film Dr. No. Classic example of the male gaze. Beautiful, scantily clad woman comes out of the water. We've seen this before. We know the trope. She's a Bond girl. She's a sexual conquest for James Bond. She's portrayed that way for a reason. Now, let's look at this clip with a different James Bond in Casino Royale. James Bond is in the position that the woman typically occupies. She's watching him come out of the water wearing a teeny tiny bathing suit, dripping with water, looking gorgeous. There's a role reversal here. Because of that role reversal, because of the switch in gender norms, this can be considered a queer moment. That does not mean that James Bond is gay. This has nothing to do with either of these characters' sexual preferences. It just flips things. So that's why we call it a queer moment. However, sometimes queer moments can lead audience members to connect with the subtext of the moment. It hasn't been acceptable for music or film to talk about queerness either through gay characters or language about same-sex relationships. So queer writers, queer actors, we have figured out ways to hide clues so that we know that this is supposed to be a gay character, but it's not obvious, it's not in your face explicit. And so if you know this is how you're taught to find representation in media, you get pretty good at picking up on it. So one example of this, I'm currently watching Supernatural still. Over its 15 seasons, its top recurring female character is the mother of the 2 main characters. All the other leading characters are men. It's a show all about masculinity and manliness and brotherly bonds and daddy issues. It's very male-centered. Because the only characters are manly men, the only way that we can grow attached to them, see them grow, is if they share their feelings with each other. And that's not something we usually encourage in Western society. Men are not supposed to talk about their emotions. So because of that, because there are these close bonds, because there are these emotional connections, this show is full of queer moments, simply because it normalizes and highlights male friendships and family bonds, which is how you get a ship like Destiel.
Why's it always gotta be me that makes the call, huh? It's not like Cash lives in my ass. The dude's busy. Cash, get out of my ass.
I was never in your...
If you know about Destiel, you know. If you don't, I'm sorry. For the sake of this video, I'm going to use queer as a verb, as in a queer moment, as in the theoretical framework. If I'm talking about someone's sexuality, I'm typically going to use gay as an umbrella term, just to keep everyone from getting confused. But you can use them both ways, and it's perfectly valid. Just know that they are different concepts. One can lead to the other. They aren't inherently connected, but there is correlation there. So, let's get into the vampires. Vampires have a lot of history. Dracula was not the first vampire novel. There's no way I'm going to cover it all. We're gonna focus on Dracula and its influences. So that means first we actually need to start with Carmilla. So this 1872 novel by Sheridan Fanu is commonly referred to as the lesbian vampire book. If you're on the internet, you've probably heard of it at some point. Young Laura is living with her father in Styria when a mysterious woman named Carmilla comes to live with them. They develop a passionate friendship. Laura begins to get sick, and a vampire hunter appears and reveals that Carmilla is not actually human. She's a vampire. She's actually the undead Countess Mircalla. They hunt her down, they kill her, Laura gets better, the end. There's a lot to unpack in this relatively short book. I'm gonna stick to our title character in Laura, but God, there's a lot there. We could be here all day. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, obviously this is queer. If Laura and Carmilla have a lesbian relationship. Not necessarily. Because it's 1872, it's a bit more complicated than that. They have a very strong and passionate friendship, and there's at least one passage that pretty explicitly talks about lesbian sex. But this relationship is heavily demonized. In the 17th century, these types of friendships weren't normalized, but they were common. Women, at least wealthy women, weren't permitted to really be around men or have relationships with men outside of marriage, even friendships, so women developed close relationships with female friends, which sometimes led to lesbian relationships. This wasn't talked about, and it was more commonly thought to go on among poor and working class women, even if that wasn't necessarily what was happening. So to read about these relationships that are usually quietly tolerated behind closed doors, openly talked about in this novel, for the Victorian reader, it's off-putting at bare minimum. Also, I want to point out some scholars interpret this tale as ambiguous, meaning we are unsure of Laura's true feelings about the situation, which leaves room for, if not a positive depiction of same-sex relationships, then at least a neutral depiction. Personally, I think it's ambiguous because Fanu doesn't know how to write women. We have Carmilla, who's just pure evil, and Laura, who has no autonomy and kind of gets moved around the story like a chess piece by other characters, predominantly men. I don't think she has any say in her relationship with Carmilla, which is part of the horror of it for me personally. You don't have to agree with me. That's just my take, and this is my video, so I get to add it. Carmilla is, at its core, a warning story about good and evil. We have Laura, who is the poster child for Christian goodness, and we have Carmilla, who is moody, demanding, sexual, and bloodthirsty. She is the original femme fatale. This shows how evil can prey upon goodness, and without dramatic intervention, perfectly innocent girls can succumb to evil. At this point in time, women are considered passive and emotional creatures lacking reason and recourse. Laura fits this perfectly, but Carmilla is a predator. She's an active character, especially sexually. She's not just queer because she sexually desires women. That definitely is there. But she also preys upon them in the way that we typically see male monsters prey upon women. She also attacks and subdues other men in the story, and she's an emotional wreck the entire time. Carmilla is a very, very bad Victorian woman, so she's punished by the narrative. And Laura is saved, but only by the intervention of good Victorian men, because good Victorian women do not save themselves. And now for the star of the show, Dracula by Bram Stoker. So, this is a very complicated work. It's very long. My copy of Dracula is right there. Very small print. It's still like that thick. It's very long, too long, honestly. My favorite review of Dracula, which I'll put on screen here, is a gif of Bram Stoker beating the dead horse, which is, you know, that's probably everything you need to know about it. Quick plot summary, just hitting kind of the main points. We're gonna skip a lot of details because it is a very detail-full story. Jonathan Harker is a real estate lawyer. He goes to Transylvania to get Count Dracula all moved into his new house in London. While there, he clocks that Dracula is a vampire, freaks out, tries to escape, gets so banged up in the process that he kind of decides that he hallucinated the whole thing. Meanwhile, his fiancée Mina is staying with her longtime best friend Lucy Westenra, who's a real hit with the lads. She very quickly gets engaged to one of the three men that propose to her, and then she starts sleepwalking a lot, and eventually wanders out to a cemetery where Mina sees Dracula attack her. Lucy's health quickly declines, the three men try to save her, and they bring in Abraham Van Helsing, a doctor who specializes in vampires. She dies from blood loss, shocker. Then a new vampire starts wandering around London, killing little boys. Van Helsing figures out it's Lucy, leads the men to her grave, and stakes her before she can kill anyone else. Mina brings Jonathan home, and they start trying to track down Dracula. Vampires need to rest in their graves, so the way Dracula has circumvented this is by bringing a ton of burial dirt with him, so he can rest in a multitude of places. They start finding his burial dirt and destroying it, so he has nowhere to go. Dracula goes, "You know what's a good idea? Turning Mina into a vampire." So she begins to turn to a vampire. She never gets all the way. And they follow Dracula as he flees all the way back to Transylvania. This part of the book drags on for so long that by the time they finally catch up to Dracula, you don't totally clock it. They kill him, Mina is saved, the end. I could spend this entire video picking apart Dracula. I love Dracula. There's a lot there, and people much smarter than me have dedicated their entire lives to studying it. I'm gonna talk specifically about Lucy, because she's my favorite, and I feel like she's the best example of the queer coding that goes on. Lucy is generally a bad Victorian woman. She's flirty and has 3 different men interested in her. She's set up in direct opposition to Mina, who directly says that she disagrees with the feminist movement going on at the time. She's a more traditional wife. Some scholars would argue that Lucy and Mina have a Carmilla Laura type relationship going on, so there's also that. She sleepwalks, which suggests there's something dastardly going on subconsciously. Then, when she is bitten and corrupted, she is treated by her 3 suitors, including Van Helsing. During this, she is given multiple blood transfusions. The vampires in the book generally are a metaphor for sex. We're going to see this through the rest of this video. Vampires, blood swapping, that is sexual. It's very sexual. The language that they use around blood, the hunger, it's really similar to innuendos and language we use to talk about sexual desire. Dracula at some point says about Jonathan, "He belongs to me, I want him." And he's talking about him as food, but the implication is still there. So for Lucy to receive a blood transfusion from 4 different men in this book, within this context, it's sort of implied to be a gang rape or an orgy, like a group sex act of some sort, which proper Victorian women do not do. Then, after she dies, she starts preying upon Victorian boys, often from the breast, which is a total perversion of motherhood and nursing. Instead of Lucy's children feeding off of her, she is feeding off of children who are not even hers, specifically boys. Lucy and Mina in Dracula are portrayed as perfect, innocent angels before their turning, and then as devils incarnate after they turn. But if you really look at it, Lucy wasn't a perfect, innocent angel, and there's a reason she isn't saved the way that Mina is. So there are obviously dozens of examples I could pull from Dracula. Like I said, the Count feeds on men. he has desire for men's blood, and since feeding has strong sexual undertones, this can be read as queerness. It's definitely breaking heteronormativity. It's definitely given vibes of deviant sexuality. And the book is really focused on Victorian morality codes, which gender and sexuality are very closely linked. And the vampires throw everything out of whack, which is terrifying for the Victorians. I'd also like to point out that this was around the time that Oscar Wilde's trial was happening, so homosexuality was becoming a very concerning concept, and it was very much at the forefront of everyone's minds, including Bram Stoker, who was besties with Oscar Wilde. Let's look at Carmilla and Dracula together real quick and tease apart some key themes, because these are going to come up later and they're important to keep in mind when we consider vampires as monsters as a whole concept. So there's a querying of sexuality, showing that vampires have desires for those of the same sex, and using sexual language to describe hunger and the act of feeding. There's the querying of gender norms. Vampirism gives women power. Without it, Carmilla and Lucy would be innocent angels who've never done anything wrong in their life. They would be completely helpless. Once they're vampires, they're a threat, especially to men, because their power throws the patriarchy out of balance. It completely upends social norms. And there's a strong sense of morality, showing that there's good, there's bad, and vampires can move you from one space to the next with one bite. The idea that our morals can be corrupted so easily was very scary to the Victorians, and it's strongly linked to sexuality and gender. Also, I'm going to talk about colonialism and disease real quick. They're not as closely connected, but they do come up later, so they're important, and they're definitely on the minds of people writing vampire stories in the 20th century. Dracula and Carmilla are both examples of invasion literature. This is kind of around the peak of the British Empire, and the thought that it could all come crashing down at any moment was very, very scary. This resulted in a lot of xenophobia and racism. You get a lot of horror at this time featuring Middle Eastern and Eastern European monsters that can invade British society and corrupt British citizens, especially British women. Another example of this is The Beetle by Richard Marsh, which is basically a more racist version of the Brendan Fraser mummy movies. So vampires are strongly connected to racism and xenophobia. Fear of the Eastern Europeans coming in and taking over British society. Also, vampirism is treated like a disease. When Lucy starts to turn, you call doctors. They use medical intervention to help her, and when they can't stop the spread of the disease, they are forced to euthanize her. You can read this as a metaphor for a lot of illnesses. For Bram Stoker, it was probably syphilis, the STD. The disease metaphor functions similarly to the fears of invasion. Evilness and queerness, as an extension, are treated like something you can catch and die from that there's no true cure for. Think about how we talk about the LGBTQ+ community today. How many parents are scared that if their kid sees a gay couple kiss on TV, that their kid is going to become gay? This metaphor and these social fears are still very much ingrained in our society, and they very much come up again and again in vampire literature. Alright, now we're going to talk about a lot of the vampire media that came out during the 20th century, both movies and novels, though predominantly movies. So we're going to start with the first Nosferatu, which came out in 1922. Nosferatu is basically German Dracula, with Lucy's whole plotline removed. Same general plot. Jonathan, who is called Thomas in this, goes to Transylvania. He meets Count Orlok. He comes back tormented. Orlok starts invading his hometown with plague, and they start tracking down the burial dirt. This doesn't work, so it ends differently than the original Dracula. Ellen, who is the Mina placeholder, sacrifices herself to Orlok by basically letting him nibble on her until the morning when the sun turns him to dust. This kills her. It's still a Dracula adaptation, even if some of the names are different. And it has the same subtext. Orlok, desire for Thomas's blood. Vampirism as a disease. The hunger is a metaphor for deviant sexuality, etc., etc. One interesting distinction is Ellen's sacrifice. In Dracula, remember, it's the men who ultimately stop the vampires. Mina doesn't really do anything. She kind of just points them in the right direction and tries not to die. One of the men, Quincy Adams, the cowboy, is actually the one who ends up staking Dracula. He dies in the process, and he's treated as a hero. He's the one who makes the sacrifice. Here, nothing the men do work. The vampire hunters fail. They start getting desperate. Ellen picks up on this and goes, I can take matters into my own hands, and she sacrifices herself. She basically takes on Quincy Adams' role, and Quincy Adams is a very masculine, rugged character. He's an American cowboy. For the 20s, that's a pretty interesting choice, and it completely flips the gender norms established in the original. There are obviously more examples. That's one way that the 1922 Nosferatu adds a little bit more queering to the original material by queering the original, kind of like the James Bond clips we looked at earlier. Next, the 1931 adaptation of Dracula. This is the one that we're most familiar with. Even if you haven't seen it, I bet you'll recognize this lad right here on screen. I don't know where I'm gonna put it. This is Bela Lugosi, and he pretty much became what we think of today when we think of Dracula. He's got the cape, the accent, the slicked back hair. That's him. You can thank him for that. This movie is pretty close to the original. Again, you have all the same subtext. Dracula desires men's blood. Mina desires Jonathan's blood and shifts from a passive role to an active role as she's being turned into a vampire. Lucy feeds on children. What I really want to talk about with the 1931 adaptation is Renfield. Now, Renfield is in the source text. I didn't mention him because I wanted to focus on Lucy, and again, there's so many details in Dracula we could hyperfixate on. But he's there. Renfield is Dracula's familiar. He's a human man who can move his coffin and bring him victims. One of the biggest changes that this adaptation makes is to switch out Jonathan and Renfield as the solicitor who visits Dracula in the beginning. Renfield visits Dracula, Dracula drives him mad, they go back to England, Renfield gets put into a sanatorium. In the 1931 Dracula, the Count feeds on 3 people on screen. Lucy, Mina, and Renfield. He turns Lucy and Mina. He drives Renfield to madness. This again messes with the traditional gender roles. Vampirism, as we've seen, gives women power over themselves and the men around them. Dracula turns both of the women in this movie, but he doesn't turn Renfield. Instead, he takes Renfield's power away by driving him crazy, turning him from an elegant and well-adjusted solicitor into a rambling servant. One of Renfield's key delusions is that by eating bugs and mice and other small creatures, he can gain their life force, aka their power, through the act of consuming them. He's doing this because he's been knocked down the social ladder and wants to be equal to his master. The methodology is like a crass imitation of the power of vampirism. But Renfield ends up in the care of several other men in the sanatorium, so further pushed down the social ladder, and eventually dead, eventually punished by the narrative, while Mina and Lucy both live. Lucy isn't killed for some reason, and if she is, then I missed it, because she just turns and then runs away. So next we have Salem's Lot, written by Stephen King in 1975. Made a big skip there. King says this is directly influenced by Dracula, and you can tell from some of the choices he made. I'll be honest, I hit Salem's Lot with the SparkNotes treatment. I don't like King's writing, I never have. The way that he talks about minorities, especially women, completely takes me out of his stories, and based on what I've read about this book, I would have been too pissed to get through it. I would have been angry. So a lot of the analysis that I'm about to carry over to you is not my own work, and it's not super in-depth. Look at the description for more places to read about it. Add anything you want. My impression of it is that Mr. King really, really did not want you to think about the sexual connection to the vampires. He supposedly didn't show any scenes of feeding, but like that's a core tenet of vampires, and even he doesn't escape it, as we're gonna see. So, in the novel, Ben Mears returns to his home of Jerusalem's Lot, shorthand Salem's Lot, or the Lot, which is just a hilarious name. I'm kind of obsessed with that creative choice. At the same time, these 2 other men move in and open an antique shop, Barlow and Straker. Notice the similarity to Bram Stoker's name. These characters are parallel to Dracula and Renfield, the vampire and his familiar, and immediately after these men show up, the town starts gossiping, and they assume that they're a gay couple. Because it's a small town, they don't like gay couples. Because Ben is also arriving at the same time, he's sort of lumped in with them. He's a writer and an outsider, so he must be gay. And when children start going missing, because the vampires are turning them, what do the townsfolk do? They point fingers at their neighbors they assume are gay, including Ben, who actually points out that going off hearsay instead of evidence isn't how you solve a problem and keeps people safe, and he's quickly proven right. Barlow spreads vampirism through Salem's Law quicker than COVID spread until you don't know who's a human and who's a vampire, and pretty much everyone dies. King said pretty explicitly in an interview, which will be linked below, that Salem's Law is influenced by the political turmoil happening in the 70s in America. This was during Nixon scandals, including Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, a lot of information about covert CIA operations that were pretty shocking for the public to learn about got released. A lot of people did not trust the government at this time. Honestly, we have not recovered. America does not trust its government at all. Salem's Lot is a response to these political fears. You don't know where the government's got its fingers. You don't know who's a vampire. And let's add a queerness metaphor to that, to just go a little further with it. Because the homophobia has drawn a clear connection between queerness and Barlow, who is our big bad villain, or the government. You don't know who's gay and who's not. You don't know who can infect you with same-sex attraction. You don't know who's next. It's the same metaphor, even if he doesn't give you a whole lot of details about feeding that are usually kind of the core tenet of, you know, vampires being sexy bastards. But it's still very much there. He can't escape it, and especially because you kill vampires with stakes in this book. And what's gayer than penetrating a man with a piece of wood? Somebody play Taylor Swift's new song about Travis Kelce. So next, we have Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. This is a very important novel because it's one of the first sympathetic depictions of vampires. Without it, none of these other books or films we talk about would matter. This book is basically an interview between the vampire Louis and a reporter who is taking down the story of his life, and the gay subtext in this book isn't really subtext. Louis and Lestat are companions. Louis and Armand are companions. They sleep in the same coffin. They have intense bonds that are not mirrored by heteronormative relationships. It was 1976, so compared to today, it's subtle, but it's very clear Louis is about as straight as a slinky. This book is really what makes the connection between homosexuality and vampirism stick because it does such a good job of humanizing the vampires. Do Louis and Lestat and Armand and Claudia do some horrible, horrible things? Yes, of course. Do you still root for them anyway? Absolutely. And it's really important to consider when this book was written and where. The interview takes place in San Francisco, which has a long history of being an epicenter of LGBTQ+ culture. And 5 years after its publication, the HIV virus was officially discovered and named after it had already infected and killed a good number of people. You know what spread through blood and associated with sex? Vampires. You know what else is spread through blood and sex? The HIV virus. There's a reason we talked about disease earlier. It comes up. It's very important. And side note, if you don't know much about the HIV epidemic, I really encourage you to learn more about it. I'll have a book linked in the description. It took the government a really long time to address it, and it's important for us to learn about why, because we need to be able to recognize it if something like this epidemic happens again. Because trust, we are a long way from handling an epidemic ethically or equitably. So there's a lot that can be said about Interview, and it's thrown social norms out the window from beginning to end. I do want to take a moment to talk about Claudia though, because I loved her. She was so interesting. Claudia is a young child who is turned by Lestat and Louis, and once she is turned, she grows up but stays a child. So basically, you have this vampire family walking around with a grandma in a 7-year-old girl's body and 2 dads. Total perversion of the family structure we were seeing in the 70s. I'd also like to point out this scene from the movie.
Now that is pure Creole. Trust Claudia to have found her. What? Don't you want her?
I want to be her.
So Claudia is looking at this woman getting dressed, and she's not looking because she's hungry or she desires this woman sexually. She's looking because she's jealous. She wants to grow up and her body is stuck in that of a child. This does two things. One, it takes what was already a queer concept of confusing sexual desire with food in that stare. It makes us think that that's what's happening, and then it flips it by giving us instead the jealousy angle. And it also just illuminates this weird dichotomy where you have this woman who has the brain of an adult, but she's stuck in the body of a child. So she's forever held back from womanhood, and therefore in a perpetual state of girlhood, which we typically think of as innocent and pure, but Claudia isn't innocent. She has a short temper and an insatiable appetite. Her state as a vampire has ripped her away from the natural order of things and put her in this weird gray space, which is really, really interesting for Anne Rice to tackle. This hasn't really shown up before in some of the other things I looked at. So, our last one for the 20th century, we have Bram Stoker's Dracula. The crazy thing is that this film is probably the best adaptation of the original novel. It's ridiculous, it's over the top, it's very campy, but if you don't want to read Dracula, which is fair, and you aren't the biggest fan of old black and white movies, which is also fair, this is your best option. It hits all the main plot points, and it has Winona Ryder in it. You can't go wrong with Winona Ryder. I don't have a lot to say about Bram Stoker's Dracula that I haven't already said about the earlier adaptations. He wants to nibble on Jonathan. That's queer subtext. In this version, Mina is a reincarnation of Dracula's wife. So not only is he turning her, but he wants her as his new wife, so that makes the blood-sucking and sex metaphor even more sexual. Also, just listen to the number of times that Lucy Moans will gain a transfusion and tell me that blood swapping isn't so over-sexualized, it's not even a metaphor anymore.
If hemolysis occurs in the blood donor serum, her red blood cells will explode. She will die. Here, take this tube.
What in God's name is going on up here?
Like, I could not keep a straight face watching this movie. Now, we're going to talk about the modern vampire, the contemporary vampire, in the 21st century. There are a lot of examples here. I'm only going to hit a couple. At this point, the vampires are getting pretty campy. It's hard to take them seriously. There's not a lot that hasn't already been done, and it's hard to make a scary vampire movie. So that's when we move out of horror and into more vampire romance and comedy. We're starting with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Yes, I can already hear it. I know that Buffy is late 90s to early 2000s. I put it here because it fits thematically a little better. Full disclosure, I only made it to season 2. I'm sure there's a lot we could talk about with Buffy. There's 7 seasons. I know that there's a queer-coded romance in a later season. I haven't gone there, so I'm not going to talk about it, but I would be willing to come back if you guys want to hear more. First off, it's a teen drama, a comedy. Before, vampire stories have been pretty much lumped in with horror movies with heavy sexual undertones, which are rated pretty harshly. Now, we have family-friendly Disney Channel-esque vampire hunting. A lot of what we've said before can still apply. Vampires go after victims regardless of gender, and sometimes even date them to catch them unawares. It's a little bit more subtle, and it's, teen horniness instead of adult, highly over-sexualized, explicit content. But the general vibe is still there. But the main comparison I want to make here is between Buffy and Giles and Mina and Dr. Van Helsing. In the original Dracula, Mina has what I think is typically a very overlooked role. The only reason that they find Dracula is because Mina sits down, does the grunt work, puts all of their observations together into a succinct narrative, and basically provides a timeline of Dracula's reign of terror. Dracula is an epistolary novel, which means it's full of diary entries, journal entries, letters between characters, and newspaper clippings, which tell the story. So basically, when you're looking at Dracula as a novel, that's Mina's work. That is what she puts together. Once she does this, Van Helsing can go and stake the vampires. But Buffy does not take on the traditional feminized role of secretary. No, she's Van Helsing here. She goes out, she slays vampires, she gets her hands dirty. You know who does the grunt work? Giles. Not only is Giles doing Mina's role here, he's also doing his work as a watcher in the traditionally feminized role of librarian, instead of one that's more masculinized like Professor, for example. Buffy as a show completely swaps the roles and gives the scary hunter role to the preppy blonde girl, and the secretary role to the articulate, intelligent foreigner, which is a really cool twist on the original dynamic in Dracula.
So, Giles, got anything that could make this day any worse?
How about the end of the world?
Knew I could count on you.
And now, finally the moment you guys are waiting for, Twilight. Now, Twilight messes with a lot of the lore, and a lot of the queer coding comes from the lore. They sparkle in the sun instead of bursting into flames. Crucifixes and holy items don't hurt them. Stakes don't hurt them. And, like, I made a joke about it earlier, but the stake being penetrated by a piece of wood, that is literally, that is literally a sexual metaphor. You turn vampires by refusing to finish feeding instead of swapping blood like you do in almost all other examples of vampire media, so on and so forth. A little bit of it is the same. Like, Alice at some point in the first book tells Bella that she smells good, which is not something that female friends usually say to one another. But the biggest way that Twilight, as a whole piece of media, there are obviously smaller bits, the biggest way is that Bella wants to be a vampire. So, first off, traditionally, in the genre, no one wants to be a vampire. Even Louis in Interview regrets it, and that's a pretty sympathetic view of vampires. But Bella wants to be a vampire. Why? Why would she want something? Because she doesn't want to be a damsel in distress anymore. She doesn't want to be a victim. She wants power, and vampirism affords her power, and she's greedy for it. And the crazy part about that is the narrative rewards her. The narrative usually doesn't reward women for wanting something, especially not power. They're usually killed off instead, but Bella isn't. She's the main character, she survives, she gets married, she gets her happy ending. I found her insufferable to read because it feels like she doesn't have any emotional responses to anything except for her desire to become a vampire. She doesn't react to Edward or Jacob or her parents or even like her love of literature. But the vampire thing, she's so passionate about it. And remember, Stephenie Meyer is a Mormon. The Mormon church really, really likes to keep women in traditional roles. So it's a big deal that Meyer wrote a character who essentially chews up traditional gender roles and spits them back out. In the context of this book and social environment that this story was crafted in, Bella's desire to be a vampire is very, very queer because it upends the traditional gender binary and traditional gender roles. Last one, we're going to talk about the 2024 Nosferatu. This film hits all the main plot points of the original, but it focuses more on Ellen, who is played by Lily Rose Depp. She has a psychic connection to Count Orlok and spends the entire movie tormented by him until she finally, against the wishes of her husband, sacrifices herself to save the town. There are basically two ways you can read this film, but they both rely on the idea that vampirism is a metaphor for sex, which we've been talking about the entire time. You guys should be pretty comfortable with it by now. The first is as a metaphor about female pleasure. Ellen is tormented by Orlok because he represents her desire, something women historically have never been allowed to experience. She is torn between her duty as a wife and her individuality and her own desire. It is only by embracing her desire and her want that the town can be saved, and the evil can be destroyed. You can read it this way, and I feel like marketing definitely wanted you to read it this way, but I don't like this analysis of it, because it implies that women who acknowledge sexual desire deserve to die. It's 2024. That's not gonna slide. So I prefer, personally, to read this film as a metaphor for sexual abuse. Ellen is assaulted by Orlok as a child, and while she grows up and marries someone she loves, she is still haunted by her abuser. Every scene in which she is, writhing around on the ground and moaning, she looks like she's in pain. She does not look like she's having a grand old time. I am also struck by her telling her husband, played by the lovely Nicholas Hoult, that she is unclean. Because think about how we talk about sexual assault to survivors, how we like to victim blame. When you read it this way, it really becomes a horror story, because the only way that the problem can be resolved is if Ellen faces her abuser. And it reflects the appalling truth that not everyone who experiences abuse survives to tell the tale. No matter which way you view it, Nosferatu relies on the idea that vampirism is a metaphor for deviant sex. One way, it's about female pleasure, which is still considered deviant. The way that we in the US, at least, commonly think about sex, it's all about the man. Female body and pleasure are completely devalued, so for the story to put such an emphasis on it is really queering heteronormativity. And on the other hand, it's talking about sexual abuse, which isn't often talked about. It brings a lot of nuance to the issue, if you're reading it that way. Ellen has conflicted feelings about Orlok, and that's further complicated by the fact that we as the audience are supposed to be appalled by him. He's literally a walking corpse. He's not the sexy, suave vampire we've come to expect from this genre. This movie really messes with the typical sexual assault narrative by showing that there's a complicated relationship there, and it's not as simple as Orlok bad, Ellen good. Which is how it honestly is a lot of the times. A lot of sexual assault happens from partners, family, friends, people you know. It doesn't happen from dark monsters and alleyways. So whichever way you read it, it does a lot to put the spotlight on the woman instead of on men, which is where the camera usually falls. And Ellen isn't a perfect, innocent angel. She's depicted with a little bit more nuance than some of the previous adaptations of Dracula. So what did we learn today? We've learned that vampires are generally a metaphor for sex, whether they're penetrating you with their teeth or you're penetrating them with a stake. Meaning that no matter where you put them, they're going to mess up social constructs, which leads to plenty of queer subtext, which is very fun to unpack. This was only a small survey of vampire materials, and it's only a brief look at some of the bigger elements of queer coding in them all. You can really nitpick here. I'm honestly convinced that you can queer code anything if you try hard enough. So I will include some resources in the description if you want to learn more. I love vampires, I'm very passionate about them, so if you guys want to talk about some more pieces of media like the Carmilla adaptations or True Blood or Vampire Diaries, I would absolutely be down for that. I actually didn't even include my favorite piece of vampire media, which is the 2023 Renfield, because it's just campy in the perfect way. Like, that is what a vampire movie is supposed to be to me, because they're not scary anymore, really. They're just kind of silly, and that movie doesn't try to take itself too seriously. I love it so much, it's great. But I didn't talk about it because I feel like it's not very well known, and you guys would not know what I'm talking about. So let me know what your favorite piece of vampire media is. Should we talk about it more? Did I miss something? What do you guys think about my Halloween setup? Do you like how it came together? Could you guess what this video was about based on the hints I put in other videos? I doubt you guys did, and I'm sorry for that. I hope you guys have a very happy Halloween, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!